one of the big issues for Israel, for Netanyahu, was Iran and its allied militias around the region, like Hezbollah and Lebanon, had threatened that they would get involved if there was a full-scale ground invasion of Gaza to eradicate Hamas. So Israel rather cleverly said, "Oh, we're not going to do a full-scale ground invasion. We're going to do these small-scale graded incursions." What they've actually done is an invasion of Gaza.
What did we learn then from the Israeli Prime Minister's press conference? He gives a good, strong, convincing performance, doesn't he? Many might say in light of criticism aimed at him from or by Israeli people.
He's trying to rescue his position. He's lost a lot of credibility, according to most opinion polls, since these attacks happened, which caught him and his establishment, his security establishment, completely unawares. And there are also increasing questions being asked about his handling of the hostage issue, where the hardline and perhaps understandable response in the early days of this crisis that he said his first priority was to get the hostages out, and he also said that he was going to wage war on Hamas and destroy them and eradicate them. I mean, those are two slightly contradictory statements. I think people understood that in the early days, but some people expected that there would be some attempt to reconcile those two positions, and there hasn't been. His public performances have been inconsistent, shall we say. So he now, I think, had to come out and say something very strong in response to these growing, calls around the world from politicians across the spectrum for a ceasefire, for an end to this bombardment of Gaza, which has caused so many civilian and other, of course, Hamas deaths, but lots of civilian deaths as well. So this is the one thing he does have a strong message on, which I suspect most people in Israel would support him. So you can't just have a ceasefire and go and pretend that what happened on October the 17th, on the 7th, didn't exist. So so he was on firmer ground today.
And I spoke to you over the weekend. I was doing Times Radio Breakfast, and what we saw at the weekend is what the Israeli Prime Minister's called the second stage of the war. It isn't a film. It isn't a movie. There wasn't a full-scale invasion in the dead of night. It's been sort of something of I want to say piecemeal, but perhaps that's not the best word to use. But it's been a carefully orchestrated invasion into Gaza, hasn't it? It's been done over a period of time to ensure Israeli boots on the ground without a big dramatic invasion.
Yeah, I think we've all allowed ourselves to be slightly conned, actually. The issue, one of the big issues for Israel, for Netanyahu, was Iran and its allied militias around the region, like Hezbollah and Lebanon, had threatened that they would get involved if there was a full-scale ground invasion of Gaza to eradicate Hamas. So Israel rather cleverly said, "Oh, we're not going to do a full-scale ground invasion. We're going to do these small-scale graded incursions." What they've actually done is an invasion of Gaza. I mean, they have tank regiments on the south and north sides of Gaza City, the capital, which is surrounded. I think perhaps it's not really comparable, but if Paris were, surrounded to the north and south by German armies, you'd say that Germany had invaded France. But so I think we may have all been slightly conned here. What it is a calculated and piece by piece invasion of Gaza for sure, rather than sending a blitzkrieg of tanks all the way down the border to try and take every town simultaneously. But then that would have been a fairly suicidal and perhaps foolish way of trying to invade Gaza anyway. So there's an invasion going on. Clearly.
Israel, clearly feel they have a mandate for this invasion. We know that Gaza's pretty much split into two, and there's a lot of concern for Palestinians who are being told to move south by Israel but are unable to do so. They just can't make that journey, or it is, they feel, as dangerous in the south as it is in the north. So a lot of them are just staying put. part of Israel's rationing will be that they want to put the pressure on Hamas to a point where they can ensure the safe release of those hostages. But as you mentioned earlier, not a lot has really happened. We saw 4 hostages released, didn't we, over last weekend, and nothing since. Do we know the state of any of those negotiations being conducted by Qatar? Do we know what a more sort of accurate picture might be of the hostage situation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've have sources in the region close to those doing the negotiations, and they were giving me updates last week. They were being positive and optimistic from what they'd been told by the negotiators. I sensed at the time they were probably being unduly optimistic. I think the situation we're in is where, some people involved in this, for example, the United States and indeed European governments, which have their nationals among the hostages, and they want a deal. Hamas wants a deal because obviously the reason it has its hostages is to get something in return, most probably the release of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. And the negotiators themselves, who are led by Qatar, I think they want a deal partly for its own sake, partly to as a precursor to a broader deal on this whole, war, the relationship between Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians. Qatar has been made to look foolish because it tries to present itself as a modern Western-aligned country, host of the World Cup and all that, which is, just happens to be host to Hamas, and it's always presented Hamas as a reasonable actor in the Palestinian spectrum. And so it doesn't look good for Qatar when this group to which it's host goes around doing the sort of massacres we saw on October the 7th. So all these people have a vested interest in bigging up these negotiations. Whether Israel was ever interested in, for example, releasing all Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails is another matter. So we didn't see any progress on the ground. We had a lot of positive noises coming out of the talks, and that all stopped on Friday with this ground invasion. Maybe it'll start again. I mean, something has to happen with these hostages, and Netanyahu is under pressure.
Yeah.
And they're not. I mean, they did get this one soldier out overnight, as you reported a little bit earlier. But I don't think anyone is really expecting that Israeli special forces are going to be able to rescue all 230 of those hostages.
Yeah, Hamas saying that around 50 hostages have been killed in a bombing. Of course, we can't substantiate that at all. Just briefly, Richard, what do we know? We're obviously focusing a lot on Israel taking the fight to Hamas, but how and are Hamas retaliating?
Good question, actually. More complicated than it might seem. So, as I was just saying earlier, I mean, the columns of Israeli tanks have gone into the side of the Gaza Strip, just to the south of Gaza City, and have sort of come up, if you like, and appear to have occupied an area of the southern side of Gaza City known as Zaytuna. And there are also tank operations and infantry operations as well, I think, or at least troops are in the northeast and northwest corner of the Gaza Strip. So, as I say, looking as if they're trying to surround Gaza City. There has been resistance. Hamas have put out statements saying that they're fighting these tanks, that there's heavy fighting going on. But we haven't had any reports of Israeli casualties yet, when the Israelis say they have managed to kill quite large numbers of Hamas operatives, both leaders in these airstrikes. But in this case, they have, isolated and killed groups of Hamas fighters. Always very hard to tell who is telling the truth in these accounts. Always a bit of bigging up of your own side. But yet, from what we've heard, Israel has not suffered any casualties, which does suggest to me that it's a better planned operation than people had originally given the Israelis credit for.
Yeah.